Namaskar to all of you. This is a series that we are doing on Sri Aurobindo's book, Synthesis of Yoga. And last few talks have been on the topic of sacrifice in yoga. And this chapter we're going to discuss today, the ascent of sacrifice, part 2, is also again linked to sacrifice and works of love on the path of sacrifice. So, in the previous few talks, we have discussed the meaning of sacrifice, its importance on the path of yoga. Sacrifice doesn't just mean certain mutual concessions or mutual gratifications or sacrificing one's own needs and desires for others. The true meaning of sacrifice is to go into the depths of one's being and discover the essence, the state of oneness inside. And from that experience, one relates to others not in a very superficial, egoistic form, but goes into the depths of the other individual as well, to have the same experience of oneness, to discover the same divinity in the other individual. And then there is an entire self-giving in that relationship. And that translates into a mutual self-giving, a divine exchange. And that is the true divine sacrifice on the path of yoga. And the priest of this sacrifice, or the leader in this process, is the psychic being. Psychic being is a term which we hear a lot in Sri Aurobindo's texts, and it holds great importance. But what is the true meaning of psychic being? How does one discover it? What is its importance? Is something very important to understand. If one is to define psychic being, it is a subtle entity no bigger than the size of a human thumb, which is placed behind the physical heart. And its importance lies in the fact that it is in an intimate contact, since it's not entirely devoid of physicality. It is in an intimate touch with our physicality, vital, and the mind. So it is there in the here and now with us. And yet, it is something which always aspires and is in a constant touch with the divine. So it is a beautiful intermediary, unlike the mind, body, and vital, which are largely under the influence of the ignorant and the falsehood forces. This is one aspect to us which always opens up to the divine. The second key importance of psychic being is that it has the capacity to attune to the divine will and stamp itself upon the mind, body, vital to execute and bring forward the divine will without inducing conflict. It has the capacity to transform. Normally, as the person gets exposed to yoga, gets exposed to the divine light, the initial experience is of experiencing the divine light at a mental level or at an emotional level or an experience of certain peace in the physical. And generally one of these elements longs for the divine presence, whereas the other elements, still caught up in ignorance, create a conflict between the different instruments. And that is where the unique capacity of the psychic being to transform all the elements and take them together in unison is what makes the presence of psychic being in our day-to-day life very important. One may take up the analogy of a king with his ministers. A king may have many ministers, and most of them would be easily influenced by money, powers, and other means. But psychic being is like that one minister which is very close to the king, who is always loyal and strong enough to bring forward and execute the king's message. Same way, it is one thing in meditation to feel the divine touch and the closeness with the divine. But very often when it comes to life, the corruption or the falsification enters into the purpose of our action. And here Sri Aurobindo writes that if that falsification is permitted, the higher light and power and bliss withdraw. There is a fallback to a lower status, or else the realization remains tied to an insecure halfway and mixture, or is covered and even submerged by an inferior exaltation that is not the true Ananda. So if the falsification is permitted, then very often the higher light, the experience of the higher light and love, it withdraws. Or if it is still there, then it may not be in its pure highest form of Ananda. Rather, it is a mixture, an intermediary form. And hence, the importance of being close to that minister which is ever loyal to the king. And that loyalty comes, if we look at it, what is it that would make a minister truly loyal to a king is actually the adoration and love. And this is what this chapter is about. It is about works of love. And how important is the element of adoration and love to bring in that closeness and loyalty, and to then be a channel of the manifestation of supreme divine love in our life on earth. To manifest it, one of the key elements to bring in that adoration love is to make our actions more inward and spiritual rather than outward and mental. It is a very common saying in India कि दिल से काम करो. But here it goes one step further कि दिल की गहराइयों से काम करो. To go into the depths of the heart and then make every action inward and spiritual. Bhagavad Gita says that, Sri Aurobindo quotes Bhagavad Gita in this chapter and says that he who gives to me with the heart of adoration a leaf, a flower, a fruit, or a cup of water, I take and enjoy that offering of his devotion. So it is not so important how big the offering is. It may be something very small, but if it is done with that heart of adoration and love, when it is done with that inwardness full of adoration, the divine takes it and enjoys it, accepts it as an offering of the devotion. In the previous chapters also, the famous quote of Sri Aurobindo, all life is yoga, the process of practical execution of all life of yoga is also to dissolve these outer mental center which always looks outwardly for its satisfaction, fulfillment and security, to dissolve that center and create a new center of faith inside, which seeks that oneness with the divine, which sees always the divine and seeks always the divine. And this object of faith, or this new center, both becomes the object of faith and also the source of this adoration and love, which truly opens up the person to deeper and deeper realizations. This component of adoration and love is so important in the path of yoga that even if it initially begins as a worship, not just internal but to an external figure, to a murti, if it's even a worship of a murti, it has the potential to gradually open up the individual to inner deep realizations. And that can happen as long as the process doesn't become mechanical or habitual, which very often happens in worship, that it no more carries that sometimes that adoration and love, but very often becomes into an outward collection of actions and habits. And that brings us to the question on works of love, that what is true worship and what does it take to practice worship in its true sense? Because if we look at works of love, we can have three kinds of works of knowledge, life, and works of love. It is primarily the heart, and for the heart, worship is something which is full of that intense emotion. And as Sri Aurobindo usually does, he gives us a 3-step formula to a true process of worship. The first step being an inner longing for the divine, an inner longing for oneness with the divine in every form. The second step, to be close to a symbol or a form or a relationship with the divine inwardly, which is an expression of the love of this inner longing. And thirdly, there is the outward act of worship which involves our physicality. If we look at all three of these one by one, the inner longing for oneness is the prime motor or generator or the motivation behind the whole process. It is the cry of the heart. It is when the desire to feel that oneness with the divine and with all takes over our entire being is the first step. It is that aspiration which then propels the whole process of worship forward. It is the soul and the spirit of worship. And as there is a certain level of experience of oneness, there is this supreme divine love which starts to express through us. And initially, inwardly, it takes an inward symbolism, which is in a way very scientific. The concept of symbolism, one can look at the famous experiment of the Japanese scientist Emoto, who experimented with water being exposed to various different emotions, gratitude, love, and fear, hatred, rock music. and in different emotions the water was immediately frozen and then seen under high magnification, and how the water molecules arranged beautifully into beautiful figures when they were exposed to the emotion of love and gratitude, versus a disorganized appearance when they were exposed to fear, hatred, anger, and rock music. So it tells us that wherever there is an emotion, there is a symbol, there is a configuration. Same, one can take the example of Om and how the sound of Om creates different organizations, formation of pyramids, when microparticles are exposed to the sound of Om. So it tells us that various emotions, they organize and create a certain sense of symbolism or certain visualizations, or it can be experienced from the inner senses as a visualization or as a relationship with the divine, or a certain form or a certain color. The experience may be, or a different feeling. So the experience may be different for different individuals depending on our makeup. But as that supreme divine love from our inner longing for oneness expresses itself, it takes an inward form of a symbol. And that symbol is, in a way, can be likened to logos we have in our life. However, unlike logos, which are one form, which stay like that, this is an ever-evolving symbol. We have talked in the previous chapters, Sri Aurobindo talks about the evolution of nature, how nature always starts from one system or a form, and it becomes more complex, and then it breaks down and then creates a new system of even more complexity. And that is how the nature evolves. So the same way as the longing and the oneness intensifies, the symbol also is on a perpetual evolution. And then further comes the outer act of worship. So there is the longing, then the symbol, and then there is the outward act. And this outward act of worship, which involves our human system instruments, the mind, vital, and the physical, is able to more beautifully express these two elements if there is a certain level of surrender in the instruments, in the karmendriya and the jnanendriya. Because in the normal state, the external instruments, they are so entangled with the world, with the experience of lack, with the experience of insecurities and desires, and then there is a sense of control through the ego with the outer world, that it finds it difficult, even if there is that longing and symbolism, to open up in the outward act and carry forward the purity of the inner message. However, if the instruments can take a pause and become receptive and acknowledge the fact that whatever is happening thanks to what it is receiving inside from these divine centers, and be grateful for it and open up more and more and surrender. And that is when the true expression of the symbolism and the love and the longing of oneness can happen outside. And all these three aspects of worship are in a way indispensable if we look at it. If there is an outward act of worship without that longing, it becomes very dry and mechanical. If there is an inner longing but it doesn't translate into an outer act of worship, then again there is that inner aspiration, but it is not finding out an expression into the world and into the transformation of the world, and that leads to conflict. If there is lack of that symbolism in between, then there is a lack of an intermediary, and the expression may not be as effective and as well organized. The symbolism kind of represents the importance of right brain, the visualization into our action in our life. One can take the example of singing a bhajan. One may have the most perfect artist with the most beautiful voice, with the most beautiful bhajan, but if the singer doesn't have that longing for the oneness, then it may still seem quite dry. Whereas there may be an artist or a singer who is not as perfect a singer, but has that cry in the heart, that longing for the divine, and he or she is able to touch every heart through their bhajan. So this 3-step process of worship which Sri Aurobindo shares with us is a medium of expression of the supreme divine love, which is the prime creator of this universe. But it is also a means, or a process is also a means for the purification of our own emotions. Because the works of love happens through the heart, and the heart carries so many different emotions: fear, anger, wrath, desires, jealousy, envy, so many different emotions. And to make way for that supreme divine love, one also needs to purify these emotions. And the process of purification again can happen through that inner longing and a symbolism of the psychic fire. It is the symbolism of the fire element inside into which all these emotions can be offered, and becomes into the most intense process of purification of our emotions. It may manifest as an outward act of lighting up a diya, as one does in Tratak, or doing a havan. But again, a havan or a Tratak done without that inner symbolism of psychic fire and longing may not bear those results of purification as it would happen with an entire offering of our emotions to the psychic fire. And to this, Sri Aurobindo writes that in that fire, all the emotions are compelled to cast off their grosser elements, and those that are undivine perversions are burnt away, and the others discard their insufficiencies till a spirit of largest love and a stainless divine delight arises out of them. So when these emotions are offered to the psychic fire, they lose their grosser element, they become subtle, and their undivine perversions are burnt away, and they are transformed into spirit of largest love and a stainless divine delight. So this 3-step process of worship is both a medium of expression, a channel of divine love in our life, and also a process of purification. And again, the priest of the whole process is the psychic being, which is the leader in the whole process. One may also ask, how does one truly discover the psychic being? It is one thing to talk about the psychic being, that it is the leader, it is the priest, but what really is the process of discovering the psychic being, and are we really even in touch with our psychic being? And Sri Aurobindo writes in one of the previous chapters that it is that part of us which is 9/10 not revealed. But that's also a positive message, that it is 1/10 revealed to us. It does come forward at certain points in our life, and we are in some degree in touch with it. To truly discover it, it calls for bringing certain level of peace into our instruments and then going inwards. And as we go inwards with intense concentration, love and faith, we are met initially with a storm of restlessness, and then with an inner vital and inner senses. And through these inner senses, we go further inwards, and with the grace of the divine, if there is persistence and there is utmost sincerity, Mother really emphasizes utmost sincerity in this, because there are illusions on the way. But if one goes deeper and deeper, then with the grace of the divine, the gates open layer by layer until we arrive at the true divine essence, this psychic being, the psychic formation around the divine presence in our hearts. And this psychic being also constantly needs to be recharged, liberated, rejuvenated through the divine touch of the Supreme Satchidananda. We can take the analogy of a bulb or a light bulb. For it to shine bright, there are two things required. One is to clear up the muck, which may be all the dust which might settle on the bulb, which is the process of purification of our heart. But it also needs to be fully charged and fully connected to its source of electrical energy, which in the case of psychic being is the divine Satchidananda. So it also needs to be charged every day through the divine touch, so that it shines bright and it stamps its authority and asserts itself upon the instruments for us to move forward in all unison towards the works of love and works of life. And when it is fully charged with the all blissful, Sri Aurobindo writes that when it is fully charged and when all the inferior forms of enjoyment, whether it's happiness or pleasure, are subjected to the shock of the intensity of its floods or currents of bliss, either these are broken to pieces of inadequate things or compelled to transmute themselves into forms of divine Ananda. So when this light of this bulb, a strong, intense joy and bliss falls upon inferior forms of pleasure, either they are broken down and shred, or they are transmuted into forms, higher forms of divine Ananda. So just to recap, we started by understanding the meaning of psychic being and its importance, how it is an important intermediary and also a very transformative and element in our system. Then we talked about the importance of love and adoration on the path of works of love and yoga, and how small things done inwardly and spiritually are much better sometimes than doing a lot outwardly and mentally. And then we talked about the 3-step process of worship and how it is both an expression of the supreme divine love and also a process of purification. And eventually we discussed the process of discovering the psychic being and the importance of charging it every day in order to shine bright. Thank you. I'll just end with a little bhajan to re-emphasize the importance of this 3-step worship, and then you can take over. And she loves to sing that song. Maybe I'll sing a few lines. Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, He Nath Narayan Vasudeva. Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murari, He Nath Narayan Vasudeva. पितमा हमारे सखा हमारे, पितमा हमारे सखा हमारे, हे नाथ नारायण वासुदेवा. श्री कृष्ण गोविंद हरे मुरारी, हे नाथ नारायण वासुदेवा. राधे कृष्णा कृष्णा कृष्णा, राधे राधे कृष्णा कृष्णा. Thank you. Can I call upon Dr. Bijlani to enlighten us further on this very important topic of works of love and psychic being?
Thank you, Mankul. Although after what you have spoken, not much really needs to be spoken. And much of what I speak, I might have spoken several times earlier. But there are certain things which bear repeating. And I really liked the analogy of the psychic being compared to the most loyal minister that the king has. The body and the mind are also its ministers, but they are not so loyal as you said. They are quite vulnerable to various conflicts and temptations and the so-called obligations and responsibilities of real life, and therefore they may deviate from the path, but the psychic being remains faithful to the divine being, our very divine essence, being the spokesperson of the soul. One of the questions that is often asked is, how do we discover the psychic being? How do we know the psychic being? How do we know that a particular choice has been given by the psychic being and is not coming from our ego and we are not mistaking it for the voice of the psychic being? These are very valid questions because, as again Mankul said, that Sri Aurobindo has said that only about 1/10 of the psychic being is really revealed to us, and it is in those moments of moral crisis that we hear a faint voice which comes from the psychic being, which tells us clearly in no uncertain terms what the right thing to do is, but at the same time it's a rather shy and faint voice, a voice that does not insist. Unlike the voice of the emotional part of the being and the intellect, the two voices that can make a lot of noise, and therefore this faint voice can get easily drowned. To help us with that, Sri Aurobindo has given in the essays on the Gita a few questions that we can ask ourselves to make sure that what we are hearing is actually the voice of the psychic being. Firstly, this voice does not emanate from any egoistic considerations, the psychic voice, and we have to be sure that there is no I-ness, my-ness involved in it. Secondly, this is a voice that is completely independent of any considerations of worldly gain or loss. So we have to make sure that what the choice that we are making is not in being influenced in any way by any considerations of worldly gain and loss. The third aspect is that the psychic being would give us a choice that comes from genuine love. Love that is universal, unconditional, and does not expect anything in return. Universal does not mean that we just remain in that blissful state of I love all humanity or I love all creation. That is very easy to say. But what it means is that even when the love is directed at an individual or a few individuals, that is independent of any of the usual considerations of blood, marriage, kith and kin and clan and nationality and religion and so on. So any of the other things which make us feel one with other people, these are not influencing it. It is truly universal in nature. It is based on the relationship of a soul to another soul and not on any of these other more superficial considerations. So in that sense, it is universal and it is unconditional. It means it is not dependent upon the object of love satisfying certain conditions. And it does not expect anything in return. So, is this choice coming from that type of love? Now, these are three questions about which we can still cheat ourselves because of the intellect being very versatile and crafty. And we may say that, well, it's not coming from the ego, it is not based on any considerations of gain or loss, and it is truly divine love and so on. But then there's a fourth question, which if we ask ourselves sincerely and answer in total honesty, we will know whether the choice is coming from the psychic being. And that fourth question is, will this choice leave me in lasting mental peace? Because sooner or later, whatever way we have managed to convince ourselves or cheat ourselves or deceive ourselves and come to the conclusion this is the voice of the psychic being, if it was not the voice of the psychic being, it will sooner or later catch up with us and start haunting us. So if there's any such possibility, we will be able to anticipate it, and therefore we should try and see whether any time in future, maybe even on my deathbed, is it likely to catch up with me, and is this choice going to haunt me and give me that feeling of uneasiness that I knew what the right thing to do was, but somehow I did not develop the courage or the sincerity to do it. So will it haunt me? So these are the four questions which help us in making sure that it is the voice of the psychic being. Another thing that was pointed out was that we may rise to the level of the psychic being, but then it's difficult to stay there. And that also happens. I can remember one person who came to me once. He had wound up his business around the age of 60, feeling that, well, I have earned enough, I have done enough for myself. He looked upon his business, although all business does not necessarily have to have that set of dichotomy, that if I'm in business, it is for personal profit, and if I have to do something which is not purely for personal profit, then this business should stop and I should do something else. Because in Sri Aurobindo's way of looking at yoga, yoga can influence all aspects of life, can be brought into all aspects of life, and that way become a part of our yoga. Business can also become a part of yoga. But we have this tendency, and this person had this tendency, so he had wound up his business. I want to give something back to the society. And for that, after winding up his business, what he found was suitable for him was to go and work with an NGO. And after a year or two, he started getting frustrated. He started feeling, is this what I gave up all my business, which was so successful? Is this what I gave it up for? Because he found that the NGO was much better to look at from a distance than when you actually got into it. And he started finding all types of faults about how that NGO was being run and how it should not be run, and how he would like to run it, and what corrections should be made, and so on and so forth. So he was frustrated, and he was spending much of the time just complaining, grumbling, and trying to correct things in the NGO rather than doing anything concrete which would help somebody. So this is the process of sliding down. And this fits in very well with that analogy of the bulb which Mankul talked about, that for the bulb to shine, we have to clean the surface. The electricity, of course, has to be there, and it is always there, but for the electricity to manifest and show in the form of the shining bulb, the dirt on the surface has to be cleaned. So it is one of those moments when all that dirt has been cleaned that perhaps this person made this choice of winding up the business. But then what we forget is that just because the bulb has been cleaned once, it doesn't mean it can't collect dust again. It always happens. That's why we need repeated dusting in the house. And this sliding down is like the bulb collecting dust once more. So he had got a shining bulb, and that is what prompted him to give up the business. But then after working in that NGO, what happened was that the bulb started shining less brightly because it had started collecting another type of dust now. So these were some of the things that occurred to me while listening to this beautiful talk that Mankul just gave us. Thank you all.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
About the last analogy you gave about a person giving up his business and then joining the NGO. And looking from a distance, what you said that he found the NGO really fulfilling and perhaps motivated by his psychic being. But what if genuinely when he enters the NGO and he finds what you said that the faults are there, already there, which he is not able to do anything about? So how he cleans up those frustrations and how it gives him lasting peace, what you said that at the deathbed?
Well, there are a few things that one can say in response to this. Firstly, that we do not have to lose our own discrimination of right and wrong, and therefore if he finds something wrong, he should not hesitate to point it out. But at the same time, when we are faced with a situation like this, one has to see that what is it that I can do within the system. Because very often it is not possible to change the system. One can work within the system and still do some good, or if one is not able to change the system, get out of the system and then start doing something in a different environment or on your own, which you think will be better. Again, I mean, that doesn't always work, because going from one place to another doesn't necessarily mean that he'll get the type of environment that he was expecting. And if he does something on its own, that has limitations in terms of both scale and reach of what he can do. Not only that, those are practical things, but he may himself find that he himself is not able to stick to the same ideals when he's translating his idealism into action. Why that happens is because any idea, when it is given a practical shape, undergoes a certain minimum degree of dilution of spirit. That is, when the spirit acquires a form, the spirit automatically suffers some unavoidable dilution. Less the dilution, the better. But all the same, even if this person tries to do it himself, he'll find that that dilution once again enters the picture. That is something which we sometimes don't realize, because we are more partial to ourselves and more critical when it is somebody else that we are dealing with. So that is why that happens. So if one becomes a little more sort of dispassionate about the whole thing, one finds that either it is possible to work within the system or find some environment where one is more comfortable. So the peace, lasting mental peace which you talked about, comes from the fact that he is listening to his own psychic being. Because eventually, ultimately, each individual is responsible for his own spiritual growth, not that of the everybody working in the NGO, not that of even his very near and dear ones, like the spouse or siblings or children. None of these we can guarantee their spiritual growth. Ultimately, it's an individual journey.